when we look at labor violence in the late 19th century, the first thing we want to understand or get is that labor violence it never it never ultimately benefited labor unions. It didn't help. It added to the cultural um, zeitgeist or cultural attitude that labor unions were un-American, anti-American, dangerous foreign radicals, hell bent on destroying America, and so the media, the newspapers, government, the cultural influences, school, church, your boss at work, always successful in this idea that any violence is a reinforcement of the cultural attitude that unions are bad or unions are again dangerous foreign radicals, terrorists, right? You could argue was the most significant event or episode of labor violence in the late 18th century the Haymarket Square bombing in Chicago on May 4th, 1886 probably ranks as, top five, top three. It's an extremely big event in late 19th century American history. At the time, heavily covered, and again, kind of proof that labor is violent. Labor organization, not good. So what went on? So the Haymarket Square bombing, the event itself began as a labor rally um, tied to a push for a national 8-hour workday. The previous day, there had been some violence at a factory between labor workers and the police, um, and so it comes after kind of a heated environment. 1886, the economy's in an economic downturn. Um, you know, the meeting started peacefully. You had multiple speakers, speaker after speaker. You started getting like radicals, anarchists giving speeches, and again that ties into this attitude that unions are radical, foreign, anarchists. They want to destroy America, and some of the speeches were there was a range of speeches from the Gompers style bread and butter unionism to radical labor unions, radical speeches like anarchists who speak out against the capitalist system. The rally ended. The rally was ending. Police were moving in to disperse the crowd. Estimates range, probably thousands dispersing. Somebody, no one ever found out who, but somebody threw incendiary device, a bomb, into the police ranks. So the police were moving people out, you know, and somebody throws a bomb, an incendiary device into the police ranks, and then gunfire starts. Ultimately, 7 police officers will die, dozens will be wounded. Um, on the civilian side, different sources have different numbers, but you had civilian deaths and civilian casualties along with police. And so that's the Haymarket Square bombing. You had a labor rally. The labor rally itself is peaceful, but afterwards, as the police are moving people out, you have a bombing. So why, you go, why Chicago? Why did this happen in Chicago, Mr. Bills? You know, Chicago had become a major key city in the movement to get an 8-hour workday, a federal 8-hour workday. And like I mentioned earlier, the previous day, at a factory called the McCormick Works. A number of workers were killed after clashes with the police. And the other issue is, we talked about, radical politics. Some labor unions were radical politically. They were anarchists. They were communists and socialists, some of them. And so Chicago had a very visible immigrant-led anarchist and socialist movement, kind of tying that anti-American, these dangerous foreign radicals coming from Europe. Then what do they do once they're here? They agitate. They cause trouble. They throw bombs into police ranks. So that idea. And so Chicago kind of becomes that flashpoint because they have a very obvious radical labor politics. So the aftermath, the bombing produced an immediate security panic, obviously. Authorities raided radical meeting places, homes. They arrested prominent labor anarchist figures. Public reaction rapidly fused around three themes of labor unrest, immigrant radicalism, and political violence. So there you go. It's un-American. These labor unions are un-American. They're dangerous foreign radicals, hell-bent on destroying the American way of life. Ultimately, 8 men are charged and ultimately convicted of what, you ask. None of them threw the bomb. Several defendants weren't even, several weren't even there at the bomb. But anyways, and so what are these eight in trouble for, right? The central legal move is to treat the case as a conspiracy and moral responsibility. Prosecutors argue the defendants organizing their speeches and publications helped create the conditions for murder, even though none of them threw the bomb. And when you study the trial, no one really argued that they did. But they're anarchists, they're radical. So their crime is ultimately what? That they're labor leaders, right? Some of the issues, due process concerns, and weak linkage between the defendants and the bombing itself. The convictions led to the death sentences for several defendants. 4 will be executed in 1887. Another died by suicide before the execution, and a couple were received reduced prison sentence and even a pardon. And so why Haymarket matters is because you see that on that slide, the slide back here, you see kind of all the aspects of what I was talking about here. Immigration patterns, politics of those immigrants, radical politics, anarchism, socialism, Marxism, communism, radical labor politics. It's easy to equate unionism with anti-Americanism if you have these un-Americans, agitating. And in this case, you're apparently throwing a bomb, And so it really ties into this Haymarket Square really ties into this, why labor unions didn't do well. It's an example. It doesn't help anyone. The strike of 1877 is another interesting story. It's the first major multi-state labor stoppage in U.S. history. That's kind of the interesting thing here. July of 1877. The Baltimore, Ohio Railroad in Martinsburg, West Virginia, starts there, rapidly spreads to Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and St. Louis. Largely a spontaneous movement, as you know, the newspapers are reporting the strike. It grows as workers across the country read about the strike and what's going on. Um, join this strike in solidarity. What's going on that gets the strike going? Uh, the U.S. economy is contracting badly during this period. The B&O Railroad Act reduces wages. That's kind of the initial, a 10% kind of wages, kind of the initial trigger, right? And so, the strike begins in Martinsburg, West Virginia. In Baltimore, attempts to move trains and deploy militia collided with large crowds, producing deadly violence. In Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania, it becomes a symbol of how quickly industrial conflict can shift into mass disorder as fires destroyed major railroad property, causing deaths and even widespread panic. Right? And then there was this strike of 1877 expands to Chicago and St. Louis. Again, this idea that these aren't just poor workers just wanting an 8-hour workday or more wages. They're foreign radicals. The U.S. government sends the troops in the army. Right? And it's estimated about 100,000 people across the country participated in the Great Strike of 1877. May have been around 1,000 arrests and around 100 deaths, depending on what figures you use. And so the strike of 1877 kind of shows you, again, there's this market for strikes, right? This, a small strike begins in this B&O Railroad and eventually is going to expand across the country. There is a market for labor unions. But what's the problem? The strength of big business, the strength of government support behind the business, right? We can call them the Marines. We can call them the Pinkerton Detective Agency to break your strike literally. Okay? Physically and literally. This is an example of, labor violence not benefiting the workers. The media has cast you as, terrorists. You're hell-bent on destroying America. Right? Next, the Pullman streetcar strike. This strike grew out of the sharp economic downturn after the Panic of 1893. Demand for new rail cars had fallen with companies. Pullman started reducing payroll costs. So workers' core grievances is going to be wages being cut, and then rents and charges that the Pullman company town know, they didn't reduce rates. So they cut your pay, but if you lived in the Pullman company town, everything stayed the same. The strike starts on May 11, 1894. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, interesting name, eventually joins in, calling for a boycott of Pullman cars. Rail executives coordinated through the General Managers Association, the U.S. government, to break the boycott. A key tactic was to encourage railroads to attach Pullman cars to mail cars. And so it framed the dispute as a federal mail interstate commerce emergency. And so another thing, if you blew up one of those cars, you're now endangering the federal government, right? So again, this is an example of, how the federal government supports business, gets involved, and puts down this strike.